Well, welcome everybody to episode 2 of my podcast series, Leaders in Safety. Over the months of June and July, the theme is going to be global, so my guests will either come from a background of having lived and worked overseas in a senior safety role, or have actually had a global remit in their role as a safety leader. This week, I'd like to introduce Paul Stevens as my guest for episode 2. And Paul is the General Manager of Safety and Assurance from Transdev Australasia. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Nathan.
Good to have you on board. And I was actually just thinking, I think we've ticked both boxes there. Not only have you lived and worked overseas, UK, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, or Middle East and Australia, but you've actually had a global role as well in your time at DP World. So really appreciate you having you on board and keen to get your insights across a number of areas today. Firstly, maybe we just tell everybody a little bit about what Transdev does and what your role is.
Okay, so Transdev is a multinational public transport operator. We work with local government states to provide public transport, be that bus, trams, ferries, and heavy rail. We've got a footprint across Northern America, all the way across Europe and throughout Asia, and we've got quite a heavy footprint here in Australasia as well, between Australia and New Zealand.
So in Australia, what's the headcount of Transdev Australasia?
Oh, look, the employee footprint is always changing as we acquire new businesses or win new contracts, but we're currently about 5,500 to 6,000 employees. Moving well over 50 million passengers a year.
Right, and so somebody else owns the asset, you're just the operator of the asset, is that right?
Yeah, in the most part, the Public Transport Association, be that Transport for New South Wales, Public Transport Victoria, they have a number of different bus routes, trains, trams, and they will segment parts of those up and say, we want to send that out to a private operator. We bid and bring the Transdev theme to what we deliver. Excellent.
Oh, thank you for that overview. Having lived and worked in Dubai, which I have as well, so I understand that the Middle East, is quite different to Australia. What have been the biggest differences that you've seen in relation to safety culture, safety systems, people between Dubai and Australia?
I think really to start off with, the biggest difference for me moving across to Australia has been that I've changed from a functional head role to now being a general manager. And, there are differences in the way that I work within that safety space. In a general manager here in Transdev, on any one day in the morning, I could be fronting up as the nominated spokesperson for a press conference or media. Then I could be going back to WHS duties, be that sitting in on a committee meeting, and then in the afternoon working with our assets management team, looking at our asset management framework. Whereas in Dubai, it was very much a functional head, a corporate safety role. How could we drive the performance across multiple businesses in multiple different countries, culturally diverse, different types of operational modes. But to speak more to your question in terms of safety cultural systems and people, to be honest, in my experience, there's more similarities between the different locations than there are differences. No one turns up to work hoping that they're going to hurt themselves or wanting to be hurt. Now, certainly there are different cultural systems in terms of the way that people are managed or led. Certainly in other countries, there are going to be more fears about the loss of their job as to whether they might report a minor incident or injury. But I would say that there's more similarities than there are differences. And an example of this for me would be, it doesn't matter whether you're working in Africa, the subcontinent, or in Australia. Really, it's the big corporations and the big businesses that lead safety. And it's those small family businesses that are striving to survive that are more likely to be taking those risks. And so, I think legislation and enforcement in developed countries comes into play. But ultimately, I think we could all be brutally honest with ourselves that if we were to walk around any suburb in Australia, we're just as likely to see a local guy who's struggling to survive up on a roof without edge protection or without harness on, as doing a small home reno, as we would be if we were looking at someone building a house in India or anywhere in Africa. And those are the challenges that are commonly shared and presented across the world.
No, it's. I was going to actually ask this a little bit later on, but it probably links better now in terms of the line of questioning. But so when you were at DP World, they had over 70 ports, I think in about 30 countries, and approximately 36,000 staff. I mean, that is one big, complex business. What was the biggest challenge that you faced in your role because of the size, the complexity, and scale?
Well, I think to speak to that, it is the fact that when you are exposed to such a large organization working in such a high-risk industry, you're clocking millions of man hours, on a monthly basis, let alone over a year. And so your exposure to risk is so much higher, and your likelihood increases. And so the biggest challenge for me really was the fact that when you've got a growth ambition as DP World has, when you work in such a high risk industry, you are unfortunately going to get to a point where something is going to fail. And in some instances, someone's going to get hurt. And, you have to acknowledge that. You have to get past the fact that you cannot control that someone's going to get seriously hurt or potentially die. But what you can do is you can put in programs in place and try and reduce the severity of that impact and the likelihood of it, the frequency. But when you've got a massive corporation, these incidents happen. And that is a lot harder than when you sit in a slightly smaller controlled environment where you feel like you have a lot more control. We were thankfully very lucky in the corporate safety team that whilst I was there, we reduced our number of serious incidents and fatalities. But nothing takes away from that first time that you walk onto a fatality scene and you have to step through an incident step by step. You have to speak to these people who are witnesses and who are, irreversibly scarred from an incident that they've seen to a co-worker or a friend, and try and understand what happened. And then you've also got the element of coming back to the corporate office and being, not taken to pieces, but challenged by a group board as to what has happened and what can we do to prevent recurrence. That has made a massive impact on who I am and the way that I it's not a experience that I would wish on anybody, but it has without a doubt focused my attention to the need to look at high risk as opposed to looking at, as the safety differently movement will suggest, and talks to these LTIs that come from, more higher frequency but low risk tasks. And I think one of the biggest parts of that challenge as well is that with the growth strategy DP World had, there were times when we were asked the question, we want to buy into this business over here. And we as a safety team would do our due diligence, look at it and say, we're buying a fatality here, guys. That site is a problem. Is there an option for us to shut the place down for 2 or 3 weeks or even longer than that? And really that wasn't there. So we would be, well, do we want to take this business on? But then you get to that kind of moral turnaround and say, and you look at it a little bit deeper and say, well, perhaps we're the best chance that operation has to take it from the smaller run enterprise and to bring in our global experience and our financial backing to be able to put it in there. Now, you can't change it on day one. So you are taking that risk that in the first 6 months, something may happen. But morally, we all started to come to terms with that that's what we had to do in order to be able to support the business to achieve its financial objectives. But in doing that, we could assist with positive change. So a big challenge to take on the significance of injury, and the questions that raises to yourself internally, morally as well.
And interesting. And I assume Transdev probably would have had a good interest in you because of the fact that you've been operating at DP World. You've got the ports, you've got water and land meeting, you've got a lot of volume going back and forth. Obviously with Transdev, one part of the business that you've been heavily involved in is the ferries business, which again has got that land, water, the volume of people. Did that experience, was a bit of overlap in terms of what you did at DP World from a sort of, I guess, process systems approach, or was it not that significant?
Look, public transport is different in so many ways, but you're right in the way that it's a high volume turnover, whether you're talking boxes, commodities coming off of vessels, you're talking about passengers. The difference being, of course, is that those passengers can talk, they have feelings, and there's an experience that they want to have, as opposed to just being a box that can be moved. And so the challenges that come in public transport are that our staff invariably are put into situations that present them far more mentally and mental safety and health and well-being when they're abused or they're spoken to in a rude manner. That brings a different dynamic. So there are some similarities in terms of the pressure of volume and consistency, but the human dynamic is very different here in public transport.
Over your journey, Paul, what have you seen as being the biggest positive change in work health and safety?
Look, I think it would be remiss of me to sit here and say that what I can see with Safety 2 and Safety D differently happening right now is having a positive impact. But I think for me, in the years that I've been working prior to coming into safety wasn't my first career. I was an engineer with the military. 20 years ago, it always seemed that safety was a tick box exercise, that there were definitely assigned people. It was a safety professional's responsibility. It wasn't an operational leader's or a manager's. It was safety is safety. Off you go, get your job done, tick the box for us. Now, without a doubt, the operational leaders, managers, supervisors that I interact with on a daily basis, the executive teams that I work with, everyone has an interest. You're no longer having to answer the question, why are we doing this? The question is, how do we do this? And there are many different drivers for the different people that I interact with. I can't say that it's a younger generation coming through, because some of my best safety advocates here in Transdev are 2-3 years from retirement. But I think that for me is the difference. Back in my army days, I can remember people, you challenge the idea of, are you going to put your ear defenders on? Are you going to put any kind of eye protection on? Now, PPE isn't accepted. It adds value. It's not we're doing it for compliance. No, I really want to protect my hearing. I understand that. But it's also, when I see that with workers as well, the question is that they genuinely believe they can bring issues or problems to you and that you're going to listen. And it doesn't have to come to the safety team. They'll take it to their operational leaders. So for me, the biggest change has been just that buy-in to safety by the wider working community as opposed to anything else. But I'm sure that Safety Differently and Safety 2 are going to be a huge influence in the next 10, 15, 20 years of my career, without a doubt.
You've got a very interesting array of stakeholders in your role, having spoken to you about your experience dealing with the unions, the Transdev executive team, not just in Australasia, but back in Europe, as well as all the the population of people that use your services, as well as all of the staff within your organization, from the shop floor to middle management. It's a wider range of stakeholders. Influencing is so important. What are your tips and tricks for influencing all those people?
Influencing is a funny word, and I always find it's I almost struggle with it when we talk about in safety. Are we trying to influence someone to do something that they don't necessarily want to do? But you're absolutely right that influencing is incredibly important, because there are a huge number of stakeholders in any one piece of work. Be that here at Transdev, we have a client, we have a parent organisation, we have a contract, we have multiple regulators, be that safe work, be that the maritime regulators, or be that the transport safety investigator. Then we've got our workers, and we've got the workers' representatives, and we've got these unions. When it comes to interacting with stakeholders, I think the biggest thing that I always try to remember is people will always come with their own idea. We all have our own belief strategies. We're all brought up in a certain way. And so someone will always walk into a room almost with their decision half made, as long as they know what the discussion's about. And you have to accept that. And you need to be able to listen and discuss those ideas before you just go straight into delivery mode and say, no, listen to me. It's listening. And we talk about listening, but if you can really get to the depth of understanding what their drive for that opinion is, then over the longer term, you can work with them to try and build that trust that you are listening and that you're trying to develop your solutions to that wider concern that they may have, or that interest that they have. And I think you've also got to be able to accept that when you're working with stakeholders, that you're never going to be able to please everyone. But you've got to be able to demonstrate that you have given them a fair go, and that, because ultimately, sometimes as a business, we have to make a decision that's going to upset people. And that could be our client, or it could be a worker, or it could be, an industrial body. You've got to allow the opportunity to listen, and not just reel off your prepared response. You've got to be able to adapt that and discuss that. And relationships take time. And you can work for 6 months, and one day you get one single thing wrong and you reset the clock. Incredibly frustrating, but over time it's about trust, and process plays a big part in that. You can't make it, I'm the stakeholder manager, I'm the individual, because I shouldn't really say this working in a public transport company, but I always work on the struck by a bus strategy. What happens if I can't make it to work tomorrow? So you I really shouldn't be saying that, but that it's the reality, right? Is that and so you've got to build the process, and the team that support you and the people that come into those discussions need to be able to understand that and share in that as well.
No, I think you mentioned trust, and you mentioned just having that patience to do those things. I think it's some really good bits of advice there for people that are wanting to, I guess, develop that area of their skill set if they're in sort of a middle management role and stepping up, because it's one thing that people do bring up a lot, and certainly your role. I mean, it is quite a complex one there. So thank you for those insights. One of the things that being familiar with your DP role, DP World role, you had a lot of people around you, you had big teams. What did you do? What did you do well to help attract, retain, develop good talent around you? Because obviously a lot of that, your success is built around all the people around you, good people around you. What sort of advice have you got for people when it comes to building good teams around you?
I'll be honest here, Nathan. It's a constant journey of improvement for myself as a manager, as a leader. Every organisation is different, and every individual that you have in your team is different. And so you've really got to treat every person as an individual. You've got to understand their drivers and their motivation. Some people at 25 years of age will be, I've hit my ceiling, I'm happy here. I just want to do what I'm doing now for the next 25 years. Whereas you might get a late bloomer, someone who's been sat there for 20 years and suddenly says, right, I want your job. And I want it in 2 years from now. And really, if you can understand the drivers and motivation, then you can working with team members. There are always going to be times when you're asking someone in your team to do a function that they don't necessarily want to do, but you've got to balance that with fairness and objectivity. And one of the other things that I like to do with teams as well is just have a really open conversation, which is that if you're trying to build a career and you think that the next step of your career is outside of this business, that matters not to me. What matters to me is that you're able to perform in the time that you're with me. You tell me you've only got 6 months left, let's make that a great 6 months. And at the same time, in relation to what I do for the business here, is if we have got good talent that are leaving because we can't give them the opportunity at this moment in time, this team's not the right structure, then what can we do to make it likely that they will return with improved skills later down the track? Look, also, really when it comes to managing my teams, I'm not a micromanager. And that does expose me to some level of risk if there's underperformance. But ultimately, what I do find is that my teams thrive in the fact that I give them the work and I'm pretty hands off. But you've still got to have some mechanisms in place to support that. And that is sufficient regular updates without being over controlling, be that one-on-one, be that project teams, be that just group team meetings. And that is so that they can feel adequately supported and that the decision making is there, but also there's a level of assurance for myself and an ability to intervene before something perhaps gets away from itself. But pushing on that as well, for people to develop and to thrive, I touched on it with the whole fatality side. It took failure in some form for me to have the biggest transformation. And so I'm not worried about my teams making mistakes here and there. I keep the most, the critical activities close to myself, obviously. But, mistakes are not there to be blamed or to be, acted upon in any manner. They're there to learn from. And look, I've also been mentored significantly throughout my career. The last 2 or 3 years of my time at DP World, I received significant mentoring. And so I hang that out there and I offer it to those around me and within my teams. Not everybody wants to be mentored.
On the topic of mentorship, has there been one person or a couple of people who have had the biggest impact on your career?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think my...
I'm not sure if you can name names or not, but...
Yeah, look, my former line manager at DP World was an incredibly challenging person. And in the first couple of years, I would have almost... I felt quite threatened by them. But really what they were trying to do is they were asking me the question, what do you want? You're good at what you're doing, but do you want to stay in safety or do you want to go back to engineering? Because it's not quite clear. You have an ambition for growth, but you don't necessarily have, you can't articulate to me. Once I got past that what I felt almost confrontational, as soon as I said, no, I'm all in, I'm in on this, then the exposure, the challenges, the bigger projects came my way. That was great to just be brought into conversations, to be given that exposure. And then, as I said, alluded to earlier, to be thrown into a group board meeting for a company with, touching on 40,000 people, employees, and said, right, you're leading the fatality debrief. you can't get past those kind of opportunities. So you've got to walk before you run. But my last boss was incredibly influential. And I'm very thankful for that. And I try to give that opportunity to those that are interested and want that. I'll never force it on anyone, but
interesting. You've been at Transdev since I think October 2019. In that period, it's a year and a half, coming up to 2 years. What's been the most rewarding part of that journey so far, Paul?
Look, Transdev is, I touched on it before. I sit here in Barangaroo in Sydney. It's a wonderful environment to work.
Lovely location.
I can step out of the door. I can get on a ferry. I can get on a bus. I can get on a tram. I can be in with our customers. I can be in with our workers almost immediately. It's the ability to work through the different businesses, not just the ferry mode, but the trams and the buses. The challenges of contract work. We've got hugely important contract KPIs. You've got to succeed at a contract to be able to win another contract, but you've also got to succeed at your contract to make your financial monthly KPIs. But the biggest positive thing for me in Transdev has been my progression to a general manager, and that is that I have a permanent seat at the table as opposed to being a functional advisor who was brought in to provide advice and to support. And when you partner in all that the business is achieving, you're already aware of what the challenges are to performance improvements. You're able to help and influence and right from the beginning. And I've been very lucky to be supported by two great managing directors here at Transdev, and a team of highly committed peers and general managers. And again, I get back to that position where I'm not being asked why. I'm being asked, how are we going to do this? And the trust is great. So being a general manager has been really, really important and great step, and the trust that you get. And Transdev really supports that.
Excellent. I mean, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, the theme over the next couple of months is global, and I really appreciate you giving us a lens to look through in terms of your time in Dubai and how your role operated, and some of the experiences you've got out of it, but also just your Transdev experience. So Paul, thank you. I really appreciate that. We obviously first caught up when we were in the Middle East together, and it's nice to reconnect with you again now that you're in Australia. I wish you all the best with your career at Transdev, and I just wanted to say a big thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Nathan. It's been good to talk.
Fantastic. All the best, Paul. Cheers. Stay in touch and
take care.
Soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.